Today I'm going to show you what's inside of the Ford Ecoboost engine and how it works. Now this is a third generation Ford Escape engine. It's a 1.6 liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine, and apparently, like most of them, this was found to be overheating, so we're going to tear this down just to see what causes these engines to fail. Now generally speaking, this is one of those compromised engines where they're trying to give you better power, better fuel economy, and lesser emissions all at the same time, which generally doesn't bode well for the reliability of the engine. Taking a quick look around here, we do have a plastic valve cover at the top here, a plastic intake manifold, as well as a plastic timing belt cover. Yes, that's right, this uses a timing belt. Then at the front here we do have our water pump and thermostat assembly, which is also plastic, and the throttle body feeds up under here. Now looking around at the back here, you'll see this is where the turbocharged and exhaust manifold would mount up to, and a lot of associated plumbing with. At the back here you also see a vacuum pump because it's a turbocharged engine. Now at the top here we do have an ignition coil carrier, so it's kind of like this entire plastic thing. Sort of lifts up here, it's already loose. And over here there's a sponge isolator. Looking at the top here, you can see we've got our high pressure fuel pump, and this is where the low pressure fuel would come in from the tank. It's going to use the exhaust camshaft here to pressurize that and then send it down to this fuel rail running down the middle here. You can see the 4 direct fuel injectors that are going to run down the middle here. I'm going to work to remove this intake next. What the heck is this? I found a piece of lead due inside of the intake. I wonder if there was like some squirrels or something in here. Next up, we got some 10s here holding the fuel rail on before I can get the valve cover out. And I can unclip this harness. My direct injection pump just popped off there. And here's the direct injection fuel rail, still full of fuel. Only one of the injectors came out, and you can see just how oily that is. This is kind of a messy job, especially if you're just trying to change the valve cover gaskets on this thing. This engine has an interesting valve cover design. You'll see that there's this section here, which is a separate piece that's metal for the high pressure fuel pump. And then there's this other half over here, which is plastic. And it kind of continues over to this other half over here, which is plastic with an empty valley going down the middle. Next, I'm going to remove all the 10 mils that my eyes can see that hold this valve cover to the engine head. Here, I'm going to remove the cam sensors on this side. Oil control valve on this side. That was easy. This looks pretty new. Cool, let's get these 8s over here. Let's see if I can pull this guy up. Let's get this guy up first. There's no dipstick tube to deal with because it's all internal. And then we'll pop this guy off. Here you can see this is the bucket that this lobe presses up against in order to pressurize the fuel. Taking a look inside of this Ford Ecoboost engine, you can see the condition overall is not the best. You can see there's some evidence that sludge was about to start building up inside of here. They're not very resilient to poor maintenance. The cam caps here look so skinny and tiny though, that's kind of funny. The valve train design is actually pretty simple. You can see just one lobe that goes on top of a bucket and presses down. There's no roller or rocker arm set up inside of here, and there's no variable valve lift. Now the back of the engine here, we'll just pop off the vacuum pump. You can see the vacuum pump. It has this little slot on it, and that's driven off of the end of this intake camshaft over here. It's got this gasket. So next up, I'm going to turn my attention to the front of this engine here. This here is a plastic tensioner pulley. It was already loose, so we'll just pop that off. Then I'm going to remove all the 8mm bolts that hold the timing cover on. I'm going to remove this water pump next. I've already loosened this before I put this thing on the stand. Now one thing with these is that they're not keyed, which sucks because if this thing wants to rotate, it can freely, unless if you've got it really torqued down there. Also, how are you supposed to check your timing with this mark if it's not keyed? You have to pretty much manually line this thing up. Now I'm going to take off a couple more bolts here. Now on the back side of the timing cover here, looks like we have a belt or some kind of rubber that holds it together. And now I can pop this timing cover loose. And here you can see the timing setup on the 1.6 liter Ecoboost. Now this engine uses a timing belt. The newer 1.5 liter turbocharged engine uses a timing chain. Now this belt, at least it's a dry belt, because there are versions of these Ecoboost engines that come with a wet belt that's actually soaked inside of the fluid. It's not a good idea to mix rubber and oil. Now obviously a timing belt is going to have a service interval because this rubber is going to deteriorate. This particular belt actually looks to be in good shape, so either it was replaced, probably the original because it actually says Ford on it. It uses an old school style tensioner, which is just an elliptically placed plastic tensioner wheel. It has dual variable valve timing, which you can see at the top here. Now here's one stupid thing. You got the water pump, which is powered by the serpentine belt, so you think that it's externally accessible in case you need to replace it because it is a wear item. However, its housing actually extends back behind the timing cover here, so you pretty much have to strip off the front of the engine like I've done here and take apart the timing system in order to change this water pump. You might as well have just made it powered by the timing belt like most other timing belt cars do. Next I'm going to remove some 13s to get this engine mount bracket off. and that pops off. This tensioner is a T40. I feel a lot of spring pressure here. And that releases the tension. And there's the tensioner. This is made of plastic, but there actually is no timing slides in here, so it shouldn't fail, right? I'm gonna cheat a little bit and put some PV blaster on this timing pulley. Oh, what do you know? Oh my goodness. You're telling me this has no key? Yeah, so this also has no key. So you literally have to line this up to the oil pump housing and just YOLO it. That's pretty bad. Yeah, maybe this is not such an easy timing belt job after all. Alright, next up I'm going to remove the water pump. Very interestingly shaped water pump. It's even got the perfectly shaped tip and everything. Now while I'm right next door to the water pump, I'm just going to remove this thermostat. Here we've got an electric motor. It's going to control flow. And then here we've got our traditional radiator hookup. There you can see the valve inside of there. And that's the hookup for the electronics. And we do have a traditional thermostat inside of here, as you can see. No! I wonder if this is replaceable separately, or you got to replace the whole housing, because the whole entire housing looks remarkably clean compared to the rest of the engine. So I bet you this entire thing was replaced. Now the oil pump does look like it's removable from the front here, but I'm going to work on the top of the engine first. Next I'm going to knock this cam phaser free. It's an 8mm hex. Well, that just knocks the cap off. T55 Torx in here. Yep. Here's the other cam phaser. So with the front end all disassembled, I'm next going to break the cam bolts free as I go work my way back. There's one more hiding nut underneath this plastic nub over here. No, I don't think there was much of an oiling issue, to be honest. These actually look pretty clean. Pry this vacuum pump housing out of here. Now I can remove the exhaust camshaft. A little bit of scoring on this camshaft. This one's got a little bit more scoring on some of the camshaft surfaces, but not too bad. Let's see if I can break these injectors out of here. Oh, I didn't break it. Whoa, got gas on my face. And my mouth. My wife is not going to want to kiss me tonight. Yeah, the oil that's coming out of here is super thick. I wonder if they put oil stabilizer in it. Head bolts on this are T55. Alright, now I'm going to zip these off. See if we can take off the head now. Well, looking inside the combustion chamber, it tells you a different story. You can see that there is some evidence of water coolant entry on this piston and on this piston over here. A little bit of water on that one. This one has the most, and it's kind of a slurry mixture of oil and coolant. So we definitely know something happened on that piston. I also noticed this little passage over here for the oil going up to the head here. It's kind of starting to sludge up over here. Those things can definitely get clogged up. So this engine was not very healthy, to be honest. Also, out of these three, I noticed this one looks like it's the most steam cleaned, which means that when coolant gets inside of here, it basically steam cleans all the carbon off the top of the piston, and it starts to look a lot cleaner. Whereas these ones here haven't been cleaned. Also, what's interesting is the shape of these pistons. They're not flat, nor do they just have the 4 divots for the valves. They actually have this interesting bowl-like shape here with a concave kind of texture. That's because a direct injector fires on one end and the spark plug fires over on the other end. That's why you got this weird shape. Now the head gasket is notorious on these engines to blow. Now the head interface where the gasket is one of the worst failure points on these Ecoboost engines. Now one of the reasons why is because you'll see the slit here that's machined into this block, and that's to allow coolant to pass in between here to help cool off the cylinders, because you're forcing this little 1.6 engine to produce 150-200 horsepower, and it's not really meant to produce that here. Now this slit effectively makes the cylinder wall super thin, and it allows coolant to come really close to the combustion chamber. So all it takes is a very small failure in the head gasket in this region over here, likewise in all these other pistons, and boom, that coolant is now allowed to seep into the combustion chamber, and you have a blown head gasket. And you see the same thing is mimicked over on the back of the head gasket here. That slit is actually cut out over here, and it just takes a tiny little bit of coolant to come into the combustion chamber, or vice versa, and then you lose compression on that cylinder. You might not even notice it at idle, but when the engine warms up and these dissimilar metals start to deform, and that's when you start to get overheating. Now this block is an open deck design. It's not a semi-closed block design like say the 2-liter Ecoboost, which can take a little bit more power. Sometimes you feel sorry for these little engines and what they're trying to force out of it. It's kind of like a little calf that grows up and they're already making veal out of it. Now the story is similar on the cylinder head over here. You see the exhaust valves on the cylinder number 4 here are actually starting to burn up because they're like that white color, whereas the rest of them are still black. Here you can also clearly see where the spark plug and the direct injection ejector would go through, hence that interesting shape on the piston head. One thing to note is that it's not always visibly easy to tell where the coolant has crossed over into the combustion chamber. Ultimately, that's something you should do with either a coolant pressure check or a combustion check. It is so difficult to see, but that black thing near the bottom is actually the valve. These valves here are actually completely caked with carbon inside of there, and that's just due to the direct injected design. You can see that's just completely carbed up. See that? And you see, that's just the thing with these direct injected engines. You're going to have to periodically take off the intake and all that other stuff associated with it and walnut blast it out. There's no real way to just put a cleaner or seafoam or anything in there, because that's not going to do anything. Yes, that is a limited slip differential. Make sure you stay tuned for that video. What I'm going to do with this head here is going to see if I can remove one of these valves, kind of see how much carbon is built up. Here you can see the cam over bucket design. Let's see if I can get this guy off. Got the spring to come out, push this valve out. Here we go, look at that valve. And there you can see how much this thing is carbed up. Now what happens is when this carbon builds up on the back of these valves, they tend to start restricting airflow coming in. Once you got restricted airflow, well, your engine's not going to idle properly, you're going to lose performance, and ultimately you're going to start burning oil. And moving back to the side of the block here, this contraption is an oil or air separator. It prevents oily air from down below the combustion chamber from entering the positive crankcase ventilation system. So I'm going to remove this setup. And there's your PCV system. Now this thing just a series of baffles. That oily air is going to come up from inside the crankcase inside of here and then go through these little baffles that you see here, and that's going to hopefully allow the oil to get trapped and sent back down, and then just air to be sent into the positive crankcase ventilation system. But we know this thing doesn't always work, and you're still going to end up with a clogged PCV, which in turn is going to clog up the intake system as well. Let's remove the oil filter. Luckily this one still uses a canister style. No! I got my brother's old shirt here. Cotton shirts are absolutely the best for cleaning up mess, especially when it's dripping all over my driveway. This here is an oil cooler, and it exchanges the warmth of the oil with the coolant coming through the cooling system. Now obviously if this thing fails, it can cause catastrophic failure where the oil mixes with the coolant, but this engine's already notorious for that anyways. This is a 12mm hex. I'm going to take off this center bolt here. I'm sure more oil is probably going to drip on the ground. There we go. Yep, there is definitely oil in there. Next up, I'm going to rotate the engine over so we can work on the bottom. Oh, look at that sludge coming out there. Now these early EcoBoost engines still use a metal oil pan, which is very surprising because the newer ones are all moving to plastic now, which suck. They even have these fins here for cooling when you're driving really fast. There we go. Yeah, just like I figured. Everything is just so thick inside of here. That's kind of the opposite of what I expected. When coolant and oil mix, it kind of gets thinner. But I have a feeling there was an additive added inside of here, and this engine was kind of on the verge of getting sludged up. What if they actually added stop leak to the engine instead of to the coolant because the head gasket was about to blow? Next we have this oil baffle that runs along the length here, and we also have this oil pickup tube. Actually, this whole thing is made of plastic. This guy off here. Now the coolant pickup tube actually looks sparkly clean in there. There's no debris or anything. I'll pull off this baffle. You can see that discoloration. Here we have a look at the bottom end of the Ford Ecoboost engine. Now this is actually something I appreciate a lot, is that this ladder frame design here actually increases the strength of it by integrating these main bearings here with these longitudinal pieces, and that's how these puny little engines with aluminum blocks are able to hold this much power because of the reinforcement here. However, that doesn't really mean that they're going to last very long. Another thing I noticed is that there's e-torques here, which means I have to go inside again and get yet another tool set. Now these are e-torques 10mm. I'm going to go ahead and remove these. Go ahead and run these out. Alright, well so far they don't look really damaged. Here's the first piston and the last piston. I'll bust these guys free. The bearings are actually in okay shape. You can see there are some wear marks on them. So in this particular case, they probably could have just reused the bottom end and do a head job. Piston number 2, piston number 3. Taking a look at the condition of these pistons here, you can see they are pretty carved up. That lower ring over there is the oil control ring, and you can see it does have quite a lot of carbon inside, which means that as this piston is on its downstroke, it's supposed to scrape all the oil inside of the cylinder for lubrication and push it back through that and bring it back down to the bottom of the sump. Instead, what it's going to do is it's going to put that oil right on top of here, which is why most of this thing is black, and burn that oil. This is again one of those compromises you have to make with these engines. They're running thinner oil, which means that they use thinner rings, which means that eventually they're going to start burning oil a lot faster than your old school engine. Now those 3 pistons look carved up. The one here that got steam cleaned actually did a pretty good job. You can see at the side here, its oil control ring is a lot more free, There is a lot more gap in between there to allow oil to go through. And you can see overall the piston does look a little bit shinier. If you are looking to decarb your engine, you can actually consider steam cleaning it, but you got to be careful because if you put too much water in there, you can hydrolock it and pretty much bend these connecting rods. Next up, I'm going to knock out these 15mm main cap bolts. So now the oil pan is off, we got this oil pump I can knock off next. Pop this guy off, and you can see this is the oil pump and where the oil pickup tube would sit. This girdle off here. Now I can pull off this girdle. Wow, those bearings are shiny. Main bearings look pretty intact. There's just some small minor wear marks on it. Alright, now I'm going to see if we can get this crankshaft off. And finally, I'll take the block off the stand. Oh, it's got a bit of weight to it. Alright, so now that I've got the engine apart, let's take a quick look at how it works. Now we're going to start at the bottom of the engine here where we have the oil pan. Its function is just to hold oil. There's no other mechanical function to it. Now sitting inside of there is this oil pickup tube, and that's going to feed directly to the oil pump over here. So the oil pump has an inlet and an outlet which is going to go directly to the block. You can see they've even given you a little screw here for diagnostics when your oil pump is clogged up and your pressure is running too low, you know, just because it's a Ford. Interesting, I note there's a heat tab on the back here, but it doesn't look like this engine's been overheated because it still has that gray section in the middle. Usually it'd be all melted up inside of there if this engine overheated. Now taking a look at where the oil pump bolts up to, you'll see oil is going to be sent down in through here and through this gallery over here down to the oil cooler and filter assembly, where it's of course going to get cooled down and filtered and then be sent down directly into the block. Now that oil is then going to be sent down in through this gallery over here and then along the gallery that runs the length of the block. You can see that there's these little sprayers here that tap off of that gallery to line the cylinders with oil. You can also see these holes here that are drilled in the crankshaft main bearings that are also going to tap into that oil gallery running the length of the block to lubricate the crankshaft as well as the connecting rod. This is actually for the turbocharger drain back into the sump. And this little dong here is for coolant from the turbocharger that goes back into the cooling jacket. Now while we're on the topic of cooling, you'll see that the low radiator hose and that thermostat plugged in over here. Once that thermostat opens up, that water pump, which is shaped like a is going to bring that coolant through its tip over here into this cooling jacket, which is an open deck design to cool down the cylinder. Now we've already talked about the main issue with these EcoBoost engines is this interface right here where you have these drilled slots. Now newer models, they don't have this slot. Some vehicles had a recall because these engines will overheat to the point where they catch a fire. Coming around the side here, you'll see two NOx sensors as well as the oil pressure sensor. And also at the head interface, you'll see this here is the oil port that comes down into that main gallery to supply oil to the head. Here you've got the cylinder head, and you'll see that there's a giant coolant jacket that goes around all of these valves here to help cool it down. That's going to come from the block into the head and then work its way out to the back over here. There is of course a coolant junction block which is going to split it off to your heater core and the turbocharger, and then it's eventually going to make its way to the radiator and cycle back around. Now if you think those valves are pretty carved up, check out the inside of the ports, and you see that's what's going to basically impede the airflow. Now look how gunked up this is, and you'll see as I put my wife's toothbrush on it, this is actually pretty hard stuff. It doesn't just come off like that, and that's why you got to use a physical means to actually take this off, such as like walnut blasting or just getting in here with your brother's old toothbrush or something. And you can't just use seafoam or anything like that. This stuff is just really caked on there. Now oil from the block is going to come in through here to lubricate things in the block and power the variable valve timing system. Now that oil from the head is then going to drain back through these ports over here down into the sump where it gets recycled again. Looking at the front of the cylinder head here, you can see oil is going to make its way from over there into this gallery that runs across here. You'll see that there's also a bore that runs this way. That's going to power the variable valve timing system. Furthermore, there's also a gallery that runs along the length of the intake and exhaust side. You can see these holes here on the camshaft bearings are what's going to lubricate them as they tap into that gallery. Over on this side here, you'll see there's also holes because there's also a gallery that runs the length here, and you can also see a little tap here that'll supply oil to the turbocharger. But like always, these exhaust valves are absolutely black, but you also see that this entire section here is pretty black. Something, maybe the valve cover was leaking a lot of oil over here. I'm going to remove these two exhaust valves. These are the ones that look kind of white and burnt up. Pull out that. As you can see, this one's got a lot of white stuff on it, and as the temperature becomes higher, that's how this white stuff starts to form. Now eventually this thing could actually crumble, and if a piece of this exhaust valve ends up over here in your manifold, well, it's going to go right into your turbocharger, which is situated over here, and that's not a very good thing because you're going to blow a turbocharger, and that's pretty expensive and labor intensive to replace, this being a transverse engine. That's just another one of the perks of having a turbocharged engine, having to replace one just so you can have that extra power, fuel economy, and better emissions at the same time. This is the variable valve timing gear. Now most other ones you're used to are probably have chains on them. This one is actually a dry one that runs with a belt. You can see this here has a 5-pointed hex on it, which I can't really get apart as easily, but I do have another video on how these work, so make sure you check that out, linked above. Now this is the critical piece of the variable valve timing system. You can see the solenoids we took out earlier are the ones that determine if you're going to advance or retard timing by taking the oil from the middle here and redirecting it through the camshaft through these little holes over here. Now while most people are not a fan of plastic intake manifolds, it is quite a bit of weight you save. If this whole thing was metal, it would be a lot heavier than this. This is going to be touching a hot cylinder head, and it is plastic, so there is a tendency that it could warp and cause a vacuum leak. Now one thing that is different though is that the PCV is actually hooked up after the throttle body, so you don't really have to clean the throttle body as often because you're not putting that gunk back into the throttle body. Instead you're just gunking up those intake valves like we saw earlier. Now if you're buying a Fiesta, a Fusion, or a Ford Escape with this engine for economy purposes, just remember that the direct injection system isn't a cheap thing to service. These direct injectors can definitely get pretty expensive to replace, and the high pressure pumps as well. Now while there's a lot of drawbacks to direct injection, there's a lot more benefits too, because you can basically control a lot of the combustion that's going on by choosing exactly when to put fuel into the cylinder as opposed to putting it into the intake and then waiting for it to go into the cylinder. And that's how you get a little bit better emissions, but also more power out of these systems. And of course at the top of the engine we do have our plastic valve cover. I just find it interesting that the shape is just so cost cutting that they couldn't either make the whole thing out of plastic and just have a cutout for the direct injector like other engines, or just make the whole thing out of metal. There's a lot of economy engines that still use metal valve covers. Especially if a tree falls on your car, you want your engine to be nice and protected. And that's a look at the 1.6 liter Ecoboost engine. Now if you do have one of these engines, make sure you clean out the intake so the valves don't become carbed up like this one. And keep an eye on the coolant level and temperature so you know when your head gasket is about to blow, and start saving up for a new one. And make sure you subscribe if you want to see more videos just like this one.